She was quite known for her feisty personality.
The chandeliers sparkled, the French orchestra played, and all eyes were on King Charles until he raised his glass, turned to Princess Charlotte, and uttered 8 words that left the entire palace banquet hall in stunned silence. It was a moment etched in royal history, not just because of its setting, but because of its defiance, because in that split second, the King of the United Kingdom shattered protocol and gave the world a glimpse into the future of the monarchy. The occasion was the grand French State Banquet at the Élysée Palace, an event already steeped in diplomacy and tradition. But no one expected it to become the stage for one of the most shocking royal declarations in decades. As foreign dignitaries sat stunned, Charlotte, barely 10 years old, was named to a title so rare it hadn't been used in centuries. The room held its breath. Then came the ripple. Confusion, awe, disbelief, all colliding in hushed tones behind silk-covered hands and raised eyebrows. The move was not only unprecedented, it was explosive. Traditionally, royal titles are conferred privately, often behind closed doors and only after endless consultations with senior advisors and historians. Yet here stood King Charles, bypassing every layer of royal bureaucracy and declaring his granddaughter's elevation in front of the world. It wasn't just bold, it was a seismic shift. Queen Camilla's expression faltered, barely concealed beneath her signature composure. Her eyes darted to Charles, then to Charlotte, and back again, struggling to process what had just happened. The carefully curated elegance of the evening had been torn open by a decision that would reshape royal succession planning and family politics in one fell swoop. Across the table, Prince William and Princess Catherine exchanged glances that said everything. The shock was real. They hadn't known. Or if they did, they hadn't expected it tonight. Not like this. Not here. Charlotte, ever composed, gave a small smile, one that flickered with pride and disbelief, the kind only a child trying to act royal would give. Her small hands clutched her napkin, her eyes wide but sparkling. She looked up at her grandfather, as if seeking silent confirmation that this was really happening. And it was. She had just become something far more than the spare royal. She had just been thrust into a legacy few could dream of and even fewer were ready to handle. By dessert, the whispers had started. "What title is this? Why now? What's the rush?" Some saw it as a heartfelt gesture of love. Others, as a strategic move in a fragile royal landscape. The foreign press scrambled for statements. Royal aides whispered furiously in corners, and French officials smiled politely, trying to mask their bewilderment. But beneath the glittering gold and crimson settings of the banquet, a storm had begun to brew. The monarchy, still recovering from the loss of Queen Elizabeth II and the shakeups surrounding Prince Harry's departure, now faced a new chapter, one authored by King Charles, and headlined by a girl who didn't even know how to spell half the Latin on her new title's crest. But behind that glittering toast and the joyful applause hid a deeper truth, one that began years ago with a silent promise from King Charles, long before Charlotte could even speak. It hadn't been a spontaneous decision, nor a moment of grandfatherly indulgence at a glittering banquet. The title bestowed upon Princess Charlotte had been years in the making, etched into King Charles's heart long before she was born, sealed by a quiet vow whispered within the solemn walls of Windsor. It was the kind of promise that royalty rarely admits to making, one made not in public, but in grief. On the day of Charlotte's birth, Charles arrived at the hospital with flowers, a tight smile, and more weight on his shoulders than the world could see. He stood over the cradle, gazing at the sleeping infant with eyes clouded by memories. To the aides standing discreetly behind him, he muttered almost without thinking, "If I can't have a daughter, I will honor the one born into the next generation." It wasn't a ceremonial remark. It was a confession, a fragment of a deeper ache, rooted in years of longing and unresolved sorrow. Because Charles had once dreamed of having a daughter. Diana knew it, the court knew it, and yet life had other plans. 2 sons, a failed marriage, and a kingdom that had never truly understood him. But when Charlotte was born so poised, even in her earliest expressions, something inside Charles stirred. Not duty, not legacy, something older, more human. It was as though fate had given him a second chance, and he intended to do things differently this time. In the years that followed, his connection with Charlotte only grew. While George carried the solemn weight of being heir and Louis played the role of the baby of the family, Charlotte stood out sharp, spirited, unafraid. She challenged him in ways no one else dared. And he adored her for it, especially after Queen Elizabeth's death. When the palace felt colder and quieter than ever before, Charlotte became his solace. Her laughter, her curiosity, even her questions about his old medals and garden roses were no longer small family moments. They became lifelines. During weekends at Windsor or summers at Balmoral, the two shared a rhythm no one else quite understood. Mornings spent wandering the stables, afternoons reading old fairy tales that Charlotte insisted he dramatize, evenings spent in the garden with muddy boots and hands full of lavender. The king, so often composed and calculated, would lose track of time with her. And in one of those afternoons, Charlotte handed him a simple woven bracelet, red, green, and gold, barely held together by fragile thread. "For you," she'd said, "because you never wear anything fun." He laughed and promised to wear it always. And he did. Even in formal settings, tucked beneath the cuff of his shirt sleeves or hidden behind his watch, the bracelet remained unnoticed by most, but deeply symbolic to him. It wasn't just a child's gift. It was a reminder of the vow he had made, that she would not be forgotten, that when the moment came, he would do what no monarch before him had dared to do, defy tradition for the sake of love. But not everyone inside the palace saw this bond as innocent. Some believed it was dangerous, because when the king starts bending tradition for one child, what message does it send the rest? As the applause faded and the orchestra gently resumed its tune, Queen Camilla sat frozen, her wine glass untouched, her expression tight behind a rehearsed smile. The public might have seen elegance and grace, but those seated closest could sense the shift. This was no mere surprise, it was betrayal. The moment they returned behind palace walls, Camilla's restraint snapped. She confronted King Charles with a fury she had rarely let surface, her voice sharp, eyes blazing, not from jealousy, but from fear. "You've undermined everything," she seethed. "Centuries of structure, years of healing. And for what? A public spectacle to favor your granddaughter?" Her words echoed through the corridor like thunder against stone. Charles, weary but unyielding, stared her down. "This isn't favoritism," he replied coldly. "It's foresight. It's a legacy." But Camilla wasn't ready to be dismissed this time. To her, this was more than a breach of protocol. It was a warning shot. A signal that her influence, her place, and more painfully, the future of her own grandchildren was being quietly erased. The grandchildren she had fought to integrate into royal life, to give status and dignity amid public scorn, were now in danger of being overshadowed entirely. And it wasn't just about Charlotte receiving a title. It was how it was given, publicly, triumphantly, and without Camilla's knowledge. She had been blindsided. Again. The confrontation reignited the ghosts of old insecurities. Camilla had spent years clawing her way out from under Diana's shadow, bearing the scorn of a nation that had once vilified her. She had endured icy receptions, passive-aggressive smiles from courtiers, and the unspoken judgment of a world that never fully forgave her past. But over time, she had carved her space. She had become queen consort, and now she feared it was all slipping. With one banquet speech, Charles had shifted the center of royal gravity, and it didn't revolve around her anymore. In the days that followed, aides leaked whispers of the argument to favor journalists. The rift was no longer just private, it was political. Rumors swirled of shouting behind the heavy doors of Clarence House, of Camilla retreating to her private quarters in tears. Royal watchers speculated wildly. Was this the beginning of her fall from favor? Had the king finally stopped consulting her? Had she lost her grip on the crown she had worked so hard to steady? Even those closest to the monarch couldn't agree. Some saw Charlotte's title as a strategic move, others as a personal indulgence. But the one person who said nothing was Princess Catherine. And it was her silence that became deafening. Because when the future queen refuses to speak, when she simply watches and waits, it usually means the storm has only just begun. And what she did next would turn the palace on its head. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't make a scene. But the silence with which Catherine responded spoke louder than anything Camilla could have screamed. As the royal family exited the banquet hall, Charlotte clutching her new title, and the world still reeling, all eyes naturally turned to the Princess of Wales. Would she celebrate? Protest? Make a public show of delight or dissent? She did none of that. Her expression remained unreadable, serene, almost unnervingly calm. But beneath that poised exterior, something was shifting. Because while Camilla's fury had exploded behind closed doors, Catherine's reaction was precise, deliberate, and far more dangerous in its restraint. Later that night, down a long corridor at the palace, Catherine took Charlotte aside. No fanfare, no lectures, just mother to daughter. And in a voice that held both pride and warning, she told her, "You were born ready for this, but that doesn't mean the world is." That single moment, soft, controlled, but charged, set the tone for what would come next. Catherine, unlike many around her, understood what it meant to be cast in the public eye before being fully prepared for its consequences. She had lived it. The scrutiny, the mistakes, the unbearable pressure to smile through humiliation and whispers. She knew that world intimately. When she first stepped into the royal circle, she had been picked apart by press and palace alike. Her middle-class background, her accent, her wardrobe, even her demeanor, nothing was off limits. It took years to find her footing, and she refused to let her daughter stumble through the same fire without guidance. That night, she made a decision, one that wouldn't be debated or discussed. She would protect Charlotte not just from public backlash, but from the institution's insatiable hunger to mold her too quickly. Later, in a rare and telling moment, Catherine shared a brief conversation with Princess Anne. It was wordless. Just a passing nod between two women who understood power, duty, and what it meant to be underestimated. Anne, the stoic shield of the monarchy, had once walked this same line between loyalty and silence. And that subtle exchange with Catherine wasn't just approval, it was alliance, one that transcended titles and generations. The very next morning, Catherine summoned the palace press office. Her request was firm. Charlotte was to be left out of all public-facing engagements for the next month. No interviews, no appearances, no photo calls. Let the noise settle. Let her breathe. Let her grow in peace before the world made her its next spectacle. The courtiers were stunned. The press bristled, but none dared defy her. Because Catherine wasn't asking, she was commanding. In that quiet act, she reclaimed control, not through headlines, but through strategy. This was the power of motherhood in a royal system built on hierarchy and obedience. She didn't need to hold a throne to be feared. She only needed to hold the heart of the future. And in doing so, she reminded the institution that behind every title was a person, and behind every child was a mother who would not be moved. But not everyone saw this pause as wisdom. Beyond the gates of Buckingham, political ears had already perked up, and across the channel, the whispers had reached Westminster, dragging the royal household into a controversy no one had anticipated. Royal honors have long carried the weight of legacy, lineage, and law, but when King Charles publicly handed Princess Charlotte a rare title without warning or ceremony, it didn't just ripple through the monarchy, it detonated in Parliament. What was meant to be a moment of pride quickly spiraled into a constitutional crisis cloaked in tradition. In the days following the French State Banquet, the House of Commons was buzzing with unease. Senior MPs from across party lines began asking pointed questions. Had royal protocol been ignored? Was there even a legal foundation for such a public investiture without formal consultation? The monarchy may stand above politics, but its actions are watched with hawk-like scrutiny, and this sudden gesture toward a 10-year-old princess was being interpreted less as a symbolic move and more as a breach of royal governance. Behind closed doors, the murmurs turned into confrontations. Labour MPs demanded a written explanation from Buckingham Palace, an official breakdown of how such a title had been conceived, approved, and declared without input from the Crown Office or constitutional advisors. Some labeled the move reckless. Others accused the king of using his grandchildren to manipulate public sentiment. It wasn't the title itself that ignited the fury, it was the method, the moment, and the meaning behind it. What had once been a careful institution, slow to act and methodical in its symbolism, suddenly appeared impulsive and emotionally driven. Was the monarchy losing its grip? Or had it simply evolved into something Parliament no longer recognized? Historical precedent provided no comfort. Royal historians combed through archives and found nothing to compare. No modern monarch had ever conferred such a significant title in such an informal setting, let alone to a minor. The press fanned the flames, One tabloid ran with the headline, "The Crown's Emotional Gamble," while others cheered Charlotte as a symbol of modern femininity in a historically male-dominated system. But even public opinion fractured. Social media exploded. Half the population saw Charlotte as a sign of a softer, more relatable monarchy. The other half viewed the gesture as dangerous proof that the royals had become too performative, too focused on optics, and too eager to bypass constitutional formality. Caught in the middle was Prince William. Until now, he had remained largely silent, shielding his family from the growing controversy. But now, he had no choice. Senior palace officials summoned an emergency advisory meeting with William at Kensington Palace, urging him to address the public or risk letting the narrative spin out of control. But William wasn't just battling the press or parliament, he was battling a deeper fear. That his father's actions, however well-intentioned, had thrust his daughter into the center of a storm she hadn't been prepared for. That what was meant to be a gesture of love had instead exposed Charlotte to the darkest sides of power. And while the nation debated legality, protocol, and optics, Princess Charlotte herself remained blissfully unaware of the chaos unraveling in her name until one overheard conversation at Windsor Castle shattered the illusion of innocence and made the cost of royalty heartbreakingly clear. She was just a child, but the world was already watching. And when Charlotte overheard what the title really meant, she quietly wept in a hallway hidden from cameras, but not from the weight of royalty. The storm had been swirling for days, but Charlotte had been shielded from it, tucked away behind the walls of Windsor, surrounded by routines meant to feel normal. Yet normal had already vanished. On what should have been an ordinary afternoon, during a quiet visit to Windsor Castle, she wandered into the wrong hallway at the wrong time and heard everything. Two senior aides, speaking in clipped voices just beyond an open door, weren't aware of the small figure standing silently behind the curtain. "She'll never have a normal life now," one of them said. The title changes everything. The words sliced through the air like ice. Charlotte stood frozen, the innocence still clinging to her small hands unraveling in real time. Later that evening, William found her curled up in the corner of her bedroom, eyes red, lips trembling. At first, she refused to speak. But when she finally did, her words struck him harder than anything the press had written. "Can I give it back?" she asked. Not in defiance, in heartbreak. William, the future king, the man trained to show restraint in the face of crisis, suddenly felt powerless. He knelt down, wrapped her in his arms, and for a moment allowed himself to be just a father, not a prince, not an heir, not a protector of the crown. But even in that embrace, he knew. He couldn't shield her from the burden forever. She was already being pulled in. Catherine arrived moments later, and together, they tried to untangle the questions she didn't know how to ask. Why did Grandpa give her the title? Why did people sound so upset? Why did it feel like everything had changed? And Catherine, steady but shaken, knelt beside her daughter and whispered the truth no royal handbook prepares you for. Because he believes in you. But belief comes with responsibility. And responsibility, sometimes, comes before we're ready. There was no fairy tale spin. No promises that things would go back to how they were. Just a mother's hand holding tightly onto her daughter's before the world tried to pry it away. That night, King Charles sat alone at his desk in Clarence House, the fire flickering, the press still roaring, and a single sheet of thick parchment in front of him. With trembling fingers, he began writing. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a decree. It was a letter to Charlotte. He poured into it everything he hadn't been able to say. About his own struggles, about why he'd made his decision, about how he had seen in her the spirit of Elizabeth, the resilience of Anne, and the strength of Diana. He ended it with a promise not to push her, but to prepare her, not to use her, but to guide her. And with that, he folded the letter and had it delivered before dawn. But while Charlotte questioned her place, one person saw an opportunity in the chaos, and it wasn't who anyone expected. She's worn the title of Princess Royal, longer than anyone alive, but during the French banquet, Princess Anne gave Charlotte something more valuable than a title, a signal. As the room erupted in stunned applause, and King Charles's voice faded beneath the clinking of crystal glasses, all eyes were on Charlotte, but not Anne's. The Princess Royal remained still, eyes cast downward, her expression unreadable. No emotion, no outward reaction, just silence. But for those who knew Anne, who had watched her move through decades of palace power plays and royal turbulence, that silence wasn't absent. It was control. And when she finally stood to make her own toast, her words were few and surgical. To those who carry the crown's weight before they understand its weightiness, may they find strength in silence and clarity in chaos. It was a toast that rippled with deeper meaning, too precise to be coincidence, too personal to be ignored. The flashbacks returned instantly to those who remembered Anne's early years, overshadowed by Charles, underestimated by the press, misunderstood by the palace machine that never quite knew what to do with a girl who refused to play soft. She had endured the headlines, endured the comparisons, and in time, earned a reputation not for charm, but for grit. While others performed royalty, Anne lived it tirelessly, thanklessly, and with a quiet that demanded respect. She never needed fanfare, only purpose. And that's exactly what she saw now, in Charlotte. For years, their bond had gone unnoticed. Moments too fleeting for tabloids to catch an approving glance during the Jubilee, a guiding hand before an appearance, a nod of assurance behind the curtain. But now, those small moments snapped into focus. Anne hadn't just been watching Charlotte, she'd been preparing for it. And then came the moment no camera captured. While guests laughed and speeches continued, Anne leaned toward Charlotte under the table and pressed something into her small hand. It was light, cold, and old. A brooch, delicate in shape, but fierce in history. One that had once belonged to Queen Mary, the matriarch known for her unshakable loyalty to duty above all else. It wasn't jewelry, it was a message. A quiet transfer of will. Anne didn't explain. She didn't need to. Charlotte looked up and met her gaze. And in that glance, something passed between them that no one else in the room would ever fully understand. Inside the palace, aides have since whispered that Anne has already spoken to Charles in private, urging him to withhold the Princess Royal title until Charlotte is truly ready. But more importantly, she's begun laying the emotional groundwork for what that title will demand. Resilience, composure, sacrifice. She sees in Charlotte not just a symbol of future femininity, but a force of stability the monarchy will one day desperately need. And though Anne would never say it aloud, insiders believe she intends for Charlotte to follow her path, to inherit not just her title, but her standard. To be the one who doesn't need to be in the spotlight to hold the institution together. And while Anne's signal remained quiet, the storm that followed was anything but, because now the Queen's will had surfaced, and with it, a revelation that would shake the throne. Buried deep in the royal archives was a letter no one expected. And when King Charles opened the sealed document, Queen Elizabeth's true successor of spirit became undeniably clear. The envelope, cream-colored and bound with a crimson wax seal, had sat untouched in a locked chest labeled simply, "To be opened after my reign." For months after the Queen's passing, it was forgotten, overshadowed by the flurry of coronation ceremonies, political affairs, and public mourning. But as tensions swirled following the French banquet, and Charlotte's name dominated front pages across Europe, Charles felt a pull toward that long-forgotten letter. Something told him the answers he needed weren't in council or court, but in the quiet wisdom of the woman who'd ruled longer than any monarch before her. When he opened it, he didn't speak for hours. It wasn't a decree or a final directive, it was something far more intimate, a grandmother's private truth, penned in her own hand. The words were measured, thoughtful, and hauntingly clear. She had written of Charlotte not as a child, not as a future duchess, but as a presence. "There is something in her," the Queen wrote, "an unmistakable reflection of the crown, though she does not yet know it. In her, I see what cannot be taught, only carried. She is the future's quiet fire." And then came the line that would stay with Charles forever. "Protect her from the noise. Prepare her for the wait. Give her the time I never had with you." The weight of those words was too much for him to bear in silence. He wept not out of guilt, but out of clarity. The Queen had seen it. Long before titles, long before anyone knew what Charlotte would become, Elizabeth had recognized in her great-granddaughter the quiet strength of a leader in waiting. A royal not defined by birth order, but by presence, by grace under pressure. Charles knew then that his decision at the banquet hadn't been a spontaneous expression of affection. It had been the inevitable honoring of a vision his mother had seen long ago. What he didn't anticipate, however, was that the contents of the letter would not remain secret. Within days, a discreet leak made its way to a senior royal correspondent, and soon, key excerpts were splashed across newspapers with headlines like, "The Queen's Final Blessing" and "Charlotte was always the one." The emotional impact was immediate. Critics fell silent. Public opinion, once divided, began to sway. Mothers saw their own daughters in Charlotte. Elder royals whispered that perhaps the Queen had seen a future none of them could yet imagine. Support surged. Even Parliament's fire seemed to cool, as if the Queen's voice had reached across time to restore balance. And so, with his mother's voice still echoing in his mind, King Charles did the unthinkable. He fast-tracked a future decades ahead, and the world finally understood why. She stood beside her grandfather, the banquet light still reflecting in her wide eyes. And though the title was rare, the moment was rarer still because the crown had chosen its next royal force. There was no mistaking it now. The journey that had begun with an unexpected announcement had transformed into something far greater, a declaration of vision, of legacy, and of quiet but undeniable power. In a ceremony held days after the banquet, away from the scrutiny of the press yet pulsing with historical significance, Charlotte was officially bestowed with her new title, Duchess of Évreux. It was more than a name. It was a message, a symbol of unity, of diplomacy, of bold departure from rigid convention. The title, once tied to a noble line in 14th century Anglo-French history, had not been heard in modern royal circles for generations. And now, it belonged to a 10-year-old girl with fire in her spirit and a kingdom quietly watching her rise. King Charles, standing tall but visibly moved, delivered the closing words with a weight that didn't just reach those in the room, it rippled across nations. "Let the future be shaped not by tradition alone," he said, "but by heart." With those words, he didn't just anoint a duchess, he challenged an institution. He shifted the royal family from the cold iron of hierarchy to something more human, more alive. The message was clear. Charlotte wasn't being prepared to repeat history, she was being positioned to redefine it. And the world took notice. For a monarchy long criticized as outdated, this was a moment of renewal. Across social media, young girls held up signs bearing Charlotte's name. Teachers used her story to explain courage. Parents told their daughters that leadership could come not just from age or authority, but from character. News anchors described the moment as the most emotionally resonant move from the monarchy since Princess Diana walked through landmine fields in Angola. Critics fell quiet, supporters grew louder. The Duchess was no longer just a royal child, she had become a symbol. Charlotte's first post-title event was modest in scale but rich in impact. A charity visit to a Franco-British children's initiative brought her before cameras once again, but this time, she didn't flinch. She greeted staff with calm confidence, listened attentively, and even spoke briefly in French, drawing gasps of approval. Those watching closely saw it. The shoulders held higher, the chin slightly raised, the eyes bright but grounded. She wasn't pretending to be royal. She was royal. The kind that doesn't need a crown to be seen. The kind that makes people believe again. A new chapter had begun, not just for Charlotte, but for the monarchy itself. One that embraced compassion over ceremony, intuition over rigidity, and the future over the past. The monarchy wasn't shrinking, it was evolving. And at its center stood a girl who had been handed the weight of expectation, but turned it into light. And as Charlotte's name is etched into history, one truth becomes clear. What began as a shocking banquet announcement may one day be remembered as the first step in a queen's making. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.